Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 6 brand new horror stories coming out to just over 2 hours of content. As per usual, I went for quality with this one, so I hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating as it helps more people see the content. I cannot stress enough how much just dropping a simple like really helps. So if at any point you feel that this video deserves one, please consider. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. I think that's really all I have for you guys. I do want to also briefly mention there are some definite mispronunciations in this video. I would like to remind people I am just a random YouTuber. I'm not trying to be a little misprofessional. I just enjoy telling horror stories. I'm not going to get it right all of the time. Google wasn't helping with some of the words. Personally, I don't think it's a big deal, but I know some people really don't like it, so full heads up, I'm aware, I know, but I just couldn't find the proper pronunciations. Anyway, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Good night, everybody. My favorite story as a child was called The Hideous Hair. Of course, it went by other names depending on who was telling it to you and what kind of mood they were in, but my father never liked that name. When we were snuggled in bed, and he sat on our nightstand with his fingers running over the grooves in our dollar store lamp, he called it the Hag and the Hair. If he felt especially adventurous, he'd replace hag with a word we weren't allowed to say as the scrawny little 10-somethings we were. The story in question was a well-loved one, passed down from our thrice great-grandmother to her son, and from there to her daughter, and so on, all the way to our father. The lesson was simple enough to grasp, but it wasn't one learned by the glass slipper fitting on the princess foot, or the frog shedding his slimy skin, or that of a prince. Once upon a time, my father would say in a hushed tone as if he were telling us some secret tale that was only for Jacob's and my little ears. There was an old hag who lived in a tiny house in the middle of nowhere. The hag in question did live in the middle of nowhere, and behind her house was a vegetable garden. Rabbits would come and steal bites from her carrots and lettuce, and she didn't like it. Not one bit. She hated rabbits. So, when fall raked the last of the trees bare, and winter's cold fingers crept up ever so slowly, she sat in her rocking chair reading how to get rid of the little bastards. That's when she heard the very first knock. It wasn't an ordinary knock, mind you. It was a thump knock. She knew it must be an animal at her door. When she moved to the door and threw it open, there stood a hare. It was white as the driven snow, but was by no means perfect. It bore mangled ears and an empty, bloodied socket where an eye used to be. The poor creature had seen some hardship, that was for sure, but of course, the old woman had no sympathy. "Miss, if you might spare me some warmth for the night, I would be forever in your debt. My warren has flooded with the autumn rain." My father would always pitch his voice up an octave and soften his eyes when voicing the rabbit. The hag's voice was always a low, snapping tone like dry twigs in a fire. For a moment, the hag laughed. It was with the laugh of a mean old bitch, the kind that made you think of ruby slippers and gingerbread houses. "You think I'm gonna let a silly old rabbit stay the night in my house? That's a gag indeed. You better get off my porch, or I'll get my gun and splatter your freaky little face all over it." The hare, terrified for its very life, bounded away into the thicket. The next evening was colder still. The thump knocking came again as the hag was embroidering a small fox into the middle of a flower ring. She loved foxes. Foxes eat rabbits. Of course, they also eat chickens, but all of hers had disappeared several winters ago under mysterious circumstances. She stood and threw the door open yet again. She met the chilly air with disgust, just as she did the rabbit's renewed pleading. "Miss, surely you can spare me a night's shelter. My body is so weary, and I don't think I can stand another night in the cold, hungry forest. I will repay you however I am able." There was no laugh from her lips this time. She only stared down at the bastard bunny. "You'd do better in the forest than you will if you keep tottering around my doorstep. Get gone, you hideous hare." With that, she made for the broom closet. Before it could feel the bite of straw, it scrambled away into the thicket once more. The next morning, the first snow of winter had just begun to grace the ground. The hag sat by a roaring fire with a pot of tea and a small platter of cheese and bread. When the thump knocking came for the third and final time, she stormed over to the door and wrenched it open. She could barely contain her fury as the rabbit pleaded. "Please, miss, the snow has come, and I'll freeze to my very death. One night out of the cold is all I ask, no more." She stomped her foot, barely missing its paws. At this part in the story, my dad would jump to his feet and stamp his foot into the ground, spooking us without fail. "Then freeze. If I see you on my doorstep again, I'll skin you good, you wretched little thing." With that, she slammed the door, nearly crushing the poor hare in the process. The rabbit began to squeak with desperation. She snatched the cheese knife from the small end table and made for the door. The hare opened its mouth to speak, but the hag gave it no time. She angrily stepped out to snatch it up and skin it into a nice fur hat, but she missed. It gaily ran inside, slamming the door behind her. "Let me in! Let me in!" she cried as she heard the lock click into place. "You'd better get off my porch, or I'll skin you to a bloody pulp." The rabbit sneered. After banging for several minutes and a string of curses that would make the devil blush, she realized she was not getting back in and walked uncertainly into the night to beg for shelter just as the hare had done. And the hare? Well, it sat right down and finished her meal. Sitting on the old oak steps of the front porch, I remember wondering if my dad would tell us the story that evening. He wasn't up for telling stories much nowadays. Now, all we heard was his soft grieving from down the hall. That, and fire and brimstone, and the word of God from our aunt. There were many things our father wasn't up for anymore. Holding a job, feeding us, clothing us, caring for us when we were sick. That duty fell on my aunt at her insistence. I read the passage over and over, absorbing almost none of it. My thoughts, scattered as they were interrupted by the crows of my aunt's rooster. I closed the Bible, placing it to the side to watch the snow gently falling. Snow was an odd sight in November around these parts, but the weatherman on the old fuzzy TV had said a cold front was coming in from the northwest. The cornstalk swayed in the gentle dusk breeze, and amidst it all sat the scarecrow. It was no ordinary scarecrow. I didn't know who'd made it, but it bore the face of a malnourished rabbit. A ridge above where each eye would have been cast deep shadows on its face, and its burlap skin was pulled tight, giving it a gaunt face to match its tattered ears. The body was painfully low effort compared to the face, consisting of only 2 tree branches and a burlap bag stuffed with hay, all tied to a post. As the snow continued to fall, it dusted its limbs gently in white. My childish brain was stuck with the notion that the scarecrow might be cold. I stood when walking back into the house. My steps were light as I crept to the front closet. In the time I'd been living in that old farmhouse, I knew that the less noise I made, the less my existence mattered. Generally, one would view that as a negative thing, but to me, it meant avoiding confrontation. I wasn't so lucky that night, though. I couldn't always be avoiding. Just what the hell do you think you're doing? My aunt snapped as I reached for the spare winter coat in the closet. The smell of sap clung to her skin and stained her fingers like blood. I considered myself lucky she did not still hold the axe. I was so caught off guard that I gave her my honest answer. I'm getting a coat for the scarecrow. It's cold. She let out a mirthless laugh. It was her way of saying, "No, the hell you aren't," without wasting her words. She slammed the closet door shut, nearly catching my fingers. I jumped. "Where's the Bible I gave you?" I realized a moment before the back of her firm, bony hand hit the back of my head that it was still sitting outside on the porch. "Go get that damn Bible. You should be ashamed. Leaving the good book out in the elements like that? Rotten girl." So, like the rotten girl I was, I immediately ran back outside to retrieve the Bible. The snow was falling thicker now, the graceful flakes mashed into blustery gray. The air tasted like dirty ice and pine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I clutched the Bible. The scarecrow was still sitting at its diligent watch. For a moment I imagined it shivering in the cold. That's when I made up my mind. The yellow grass crackled under my feet. It was the kind that stayed perpetually crunchy, even in the lushest of springs. "Hello?" I said meekly as I came to a stop right in front of it. "I thought you might like a little company." The hair-crow gave no reply. I found myself relieved that it had not spoken back, as if that were a reasonable thing to fear in the first place. "You looked lonely and cold, so I came to give you this." I shrugged the jacket from my shoulders and stood on my tiptoes to affix it to its branchy ones. The breeze that swayed the cornstalk slowly died. The quiet was serene until it went for too long. I felt the cold fingers of observance creep up my back. Something was watching me. "How can you watch the fields if you don't have any eyes?" I asked it, mostly to break the silence. "Here, let me fix that for you. Everyone deserves to see, especially you. You have such a nice view of the sunset." I took out the permanent marker left in my overalls pocket from when Aunt Rachel had made me copy Bible verses earlier after I couldn't find her misplaced axe. I was nearly unable to reach, but I managed. I gave it the best rabbit-looking eyes I could. We stood there for a minute, observing each other. Finally, I turned back. "I'll see you again soon." I tossed over my shoulder as I began to brisk walk back to the warmth of the house. My aunt was mercifully drooling in her rocking chair, some late-night program droning on behind her snores. My father was awake in his room, even though I couldn't hear his voice. His grief was loud enough. I sat the Bible down on the china cabinet. My shoulders hadn't stopped shaking, and I blew into my red hands, trying to bring the feeling back to them. "You really are one of a kind, Pandora." The scent of cocoa rose from the pot Jacob was stirring, warm and inviting. He was the one lucky enough to be allowed to use the stove out of the two of us. "I watched you out the window, you know." My shoulders relaxed. They'd been tense since meeting the scarecrow for no particular reason. It had only been Jacob's eyes on me. "I don't know why you'd get close to that scarecrow, much less give it your jacket. That thing, it freaks me out," he confessed as he poured the steaming chocolate into 2 silver mugs. I sighed. "Nobody deserves to be alone," was all I could say. He rubbed his thumb over his bottom lip for a few moments, something he did when lost in thought, and then he smiled. "Fair enough. But you'd better not go asking me for any of my clothes when yours are on that rabbit out there. You'll be running around yelling, 'My shoes, my shoes! The rabbit took my shoes!' But you'll just have to be barefoot as that scarecrow tap dances all the way to New York City in little Pandora's Chuck Taylors." We both howled with laughter at this until we nearly woke my aunt. Once we'd drained our mugs and my body had returned to its normal temperature, we moved up the creaking oak stairs to our bedroom. Worn white bed covers swallowed us whole, and we both fell into a comfortable silence. There was no bedtime story from our father that night. Just as the first rays of sun were creeping over the windowsill, and the rats in the walls were beginning to quiet, Aunt Rachel woke us for school with little more than a, "Breakfast is downstairs. Don't be late." She was a brash woman. Some would call her behavior abusive, and they'd be right. But in those days, it was all filed under the all too broad label of strict. Still, she did the bare minimum of keeping us alive and healthy. As I walked out onto the porch, where the thin layers of snow from the night before had begun to melt, I saw my jacket. Jacob dragged behind me, and I wondered if it was him who'd retrieved the jacket and left it there on the porch, so our aunt wouldn't turn my backside inside out. I just shrugged and put it on. Jacob met me at the bottom step with our school bags, and off we walked. It wasn't a long walk to and from school. The town had one bus and one route. It didn't end up in our neck of the woods, for one reason or another. Though school was a safe haven, I hadn't made any friends there. Today would be the day that changed. That day was the day when the teacher stood at the front of the class with a girl clutching the back straps of her Lisa Frank backpack and introduced Naomi to the class. When I met the girl who showed me her favorite books among the middle school library shelves, when I met the girl who held my hand in the hallway and gave me a quick, innocent kiss behind the tunnel on the rickety playground, that day changed my life forever. I skipped down the dirt road home, Jacob trying his best to keep up with me. The breath of honeysuckle flowers in the air felt sweeter that afternoon. "What's got you about to fly away, Pandora? Geez, you're like a kite." For the first time since getting to school that morning, I felt a note of hesitation. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened had I kept my secret, if I hadn't found validation in Jacob. I scanned around and then whispered as if the very trees and dirt had eyes and ears. "I kissed a girl today, Jake." Instead of spiel about how it was wrong like some small part of me expected, an "ooh" rose from his mouth. The kind of jeering that fills classrooms when someone gets called to the principal's office. "Pandora has a crush on somebody. Is it the new girl?" We spent the last leg of our journey home lightheartedly bickering back and forth as all siblings tend to do. It was only when the house came into view that Jacob grabbed my arm and stopped me. There was a deep sadness in his voice. "Pandora, listen to me. This is important. Whatever you do, you cannot tell Aunt Rachel about this. She won't like it. I want you to keep it a secret between us for now, okay?" At that time, it didn't click in my mind why he'd said that. The bruises on Jacob's arms and legs, the cries of "unclean" from my aunt, and the sad look he often had in his eyes in that year we lived with her never truly hit me until the day it did. We got inside and were immediately put in work in the back garden. The afternoon moved slower than a slug in molasses until Aunt Rachel sent us to bed after a meal of watery chicken stew and a too-hot bath. My muscles ached as I pulled open our window. I paused, listening for Jacob's slow and even breathing. When he didn't stir, I climbed out onto the front porch roof. I slid down the wooden support and turned my eyes out to the field. There sat that scarecrow. The half moon hung low in the sky above it, a yellow and slightly sour lemon wedge. I walked up to him as if approaching an old friend. Mr. Haircrow? No, that's not right. You need a name. Everybody needs a name. How about Frith? The name had worked its way out of the corners of my mind. From when I lifted Watership down from the high school only section of the library, it fit in a way I knew nothing else would. The wind made the cornstalks sway. Almost in approval, I smiled. I love names, especially Naomi. I love the name Naomi. I imagined that the scarecrow was giving me a knowing look. Okay, I know. I'll tell you what happened. So just like with my brother, I relayed my secret in a quiet tone, as if I was telling it the directions to some treasure deep in a swamp. Frith, for his part, listened patiently and quietly. I talked with him until the first hints of the sun lightened the night sky. Once I realized that dawn was fast approaching, I scrambled back onto the roof and onto my bed. I thought you'd gone and gotten yourself killed. I heard him before I saw him. Jacob was sitting up with his eyes weak from sleep. Then I went and looked out the window. Why do you like that scarecrow so much? It gives me the creeps. I sighed as I began to change out of my pajamas and into my school clothes. I hadn't shut my eyes the entire night. School would be exhausting today, even if it was better than here. He looks lonely. Nobody deserves to be alone, and I know I'm the only one who's brave enough to go spend time with him. I paused to pull on my shoes before adding, "No offense, Jacob." He pulled himself out of bed, and the cycle of school, chores, homework, bed started all over again. Whatever free time I had was spent with my brother, my nose in whatever books I could hide from my aunt, or talking with my quiet friend Frith. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into nearly a year. My aunt only got worse in her treatment of us. The nights we were sent to bed without supper, and the pages of Bible verses we had written gradually grew in number. We saw very little of our father during that time, only the ghost of his footsteps moving to and from the kitchen or bathroom at odd hours of the night, and the whispers of weeping for our mother and his wife. I never blamed him for turning a blind eye to our abuse, and I still don't. He was at the bottom of an inescapable ocean. That was why, when he walked in on the night of Halloween, after we'd been sent to bed without supper yet again, Jacob and I were shocked to see him appear in our doorway. He looked fragile, in the purest sense of the word. His perpetually sore eyes crisscrossed with red veins. He'd eaten very little food in the months since we'd gotten here, and his figure reflected that. He was more rake than man. He ran a hand through his matted orange hair and sucked in a breath through chapped lips. I held in my tears at the sight of him. "You kiddos have time for a bedtime story?" I saw the renewed joy in his eyes when our faces lit up. "I think we can fit you into our schedule," Jacob said in a breathless, happy voice. He sat down at the edge of my bed as Jacob flew across the room to us. Our father started a tale about a little girl living high in a tower, but I stopped him. "Dad, you should tell us something scary. It is Halloween after all." He rubbed his scruffy chin as he considered my request. "You two are awfully young for that sort of thing, aren't you?" I laughed a little. "Dad, I'm 13. For a moment, his eyes filled with sorrow. I know now what that look meant. It was one of a man watching the lives of his kids slip by him, knowing he wasn't present for it. I guess you're right. After several long moments of deep thought, our father began to weave a tale about two little girls wandering in the forest on Halloween to find a magic well. only to find out it was haunted. It wasn't his best, but it kept us gripped until the very end. When his story concluded, he stood up and rubbed his face. I love you both so much. Don't ever forget that. He reached out a hand and offered us both a small brownie in the shape of a jack-o'-lantern. Our aunt didn't believe in Halloween, so there was no hoard of treats to be had for us. Jacob and I eagerly took the treats, and our dad smiled. As we filled our stomachs with the sweet chocolate goodness, he got to his feet and wiped at his perpetually weepy eyes. I'll be around more for you two now. I promise. I can't say for certain whether he would have kept that promise or not. I like to think that he would have. The weekend slipped by like a fish in oil. I stood at my locker just after lunch Monday morning, searching for my math homework. My face flushed when I felt two firm fingers press into my shoulder blade. Door, you'll never guess what I saw, Naomi whispered, as if she'd seen into King Tut's tomb. I stood turning towards her. Her eyes were soft but sly. She was hell on wheels, but she made my heart sing. What? Don't leave me in suspense. She nodded towards the block of lockers where the obnoxious teen boys would often mill about and said, You see that locker over there? There's something in it. A Playboy. I was a sheltered child. She said the word Playboy with a drama that didn't land for me. What's that? She took my hand as we crept down the hall. It was beginning to empty out as stir-crazy kids piled into the worn jungle gyms and swings outside. It's a magazine with naked ladies. My jaw dropped. Seriously? I think I can get it for us, she said with a grin. The concept of something so scandalous and private in my young mind being proudly on display along with my still emerging sexuality made it an offer too tempting to pass up. We found the locker in question, and she held a callous hand up to her ear as she worked the cheap blue lock. Naomi was an artist, and her medium was mischief. When the padlock popped open with ease, she handed it to me. You do the honors. No snooping. We just want the magazine. Naomi had a strange sense of morals about such things. Thievery was fair game, but only in moderation. Nothing more than we came for. She would have made a wonderful Robin Hood. I pulled open the locker and my heart froze in my chest. It was empty save for a large white hair, twitching on the metal floor. Its head bent sideways, and dark, frothy blood dribbled out of its nose and mouth, pooling onto the floor. Bile rose in my throat as a jarring noise grew around me. From everywhere and nowhere. The dying squeals of a rabbit were something I should have considered myself lucky not to have heard before then. The cries felt like a child's, one that was screaming for their life. Before I knew what was happening, I felt the lockers on the opposite side of the hallway against my back. I tumbled to the floor as a wave of nausea and dizziness washed over me. Pandora, are you okay? Naomi helped me to my feet and steadied me. I pointed at the locker, blubbering something about rabbits. She looked, and then so did I. It was gone. I wondered if it was ever there in the first place. I rubbed my eyes as Naomi nabbed the dirty magazine. I haven't been sleeping very well lately, I muttered. Bad dreams. She smiled and put a hand on my shoulder. That's what rabbits do, don't they? They disappear. I laughed. Then she laughed. Then we laughed so hard I forgot about what we were laughing about. She pulled me into the bathroom and we flipped through the pages of nude women in erotic poses as we huddled in the last stall on the right. When the bell rang, she pressed a soft kiss to my mouth and asked, Do you want to keep it? I stared at the outstretched magazine. The offer was tempting, yet so dangerous. Live a little, she joked in response to my hesitant expression. Open the box, Pandora. Okay. I finally relented. Wait 1 second. She took out her favorite purple Sharpie, the one she always kept on her. I watched her scribble at the very last page, right across the chest of a woman in a barely there bathing suit. It was an address and a phone number. As soon as I got home, I wrote it down in my journal. Had I not done that, Naomi likely would have been a middle school love, lost to the endless march of time and life. But that fate was instead replaced with a stream of letters that lasted well into my teens. Loving at first, but then only mutually friendly. I squirreled the Playboy away under my bed, tucking it so it lay parallel with the frame. There, I assumed it was safe. I dared not bring it out again unless I was sure I was alone, in the deadest of autumn nights. Another week trickled by. The following Monday was calm until we returned home from school. On that day, Jacob had been stopped by our Mastiff Blue in the yard. So much of my mental energy is spent on reflection and what-ifs. Wondering what would have happened had Jacob followed me like usual is one of the most persistent. The wind whipped dry red leaves around the front yard as I stared out the window in the kitchen. My stomach growled and I moved to fix myself a sandwich, wondering why my aunt had not yet accosted us for chores or homework. Behind me, I heard the quiet yet anxiety-inducing clacking of her shoes as she entered the room. I sat down the knife I'd been holding, and for far too long. It was absolutely silent. Then, under her breath, I heard the words, "Too many chances," and "the devil in my house." I turned towards her and was knocked off balance by the backside of her hand crashing into my face. Her voice was full of cold fury. "Do you want to tell me what this is, you wretched little thing?" I whimpered as she knocked me to the hard kitchen floor. I knew exactly what it was. It was the goddamned Playboy. I thought I'd hidden it well enough. I was wrong. "You sinful little harpy, with your book full of whores." She snatched up my hair and started dragging me out through the doorway and towards the stairs. I thrashed desperately. "You disgusting little freak. I've tolerated this long enough. I've allowed Satan to take up residence in my house. I will not have it any longer. Your sin will not go unpunished." Her voice popped and cracked with an unspeakable rage, less curt than it had been before. My fingernails raked at the stairs and anything else I might try and gain purchase on as my head thumped against each solid wooden step. My nose hit the wall at one point, exploding with blood. I tasted dust and copper. By the time we were on the second floor, I was too dizzy to scream for help. She dragged me into the bathroom and slammed the door, locking it. "You will both have to stand before the Lord and be judged. I will make sure of it. He will throw your wretched, miserable souls into the great inferno." I wailed as she began to fill the tub with water. Urgent footsteps pounded around the kitchen downstairs, though I could not decipher their owner. Pulling myself up, I tried to throw myself towards the door. She caught me by my neck. "Please," I begged. "Please don't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She spit in my face. "If you're lucky, maybe this water will purge you before you stand before God Almighty," she whispered as she plunged my head underneath the icy water, and my world went blurry. My body burst into uncontrollable shivers as I flailed desperately. I could feel my lungs filling with cold water as my aunt held her grip. As she slammed my face against the porcelain bottom of the bathtub, crimson bloomed out into the water. For a moment, I thought of death. I wondered whether fire and brimstone truly would be waiting for me on the other end. Then I heard the screaming, the clatter of metal on metal, the breaking of glass, and the barking of a dog. Behind all that, I could hear another sound my delirious brain couldn't recognize. My aunt released me and stood up, storming out the bathroom door with a slew of curses. I threw myself from the tub, throwing up mouthfuls of frigid water before gulping in as much air as I could. I struggled onto weak legs and ran for my life. I rammed my shoulder into the back door and tumbled ass over elbows down the back steps. I could hear the cacophony of noises that had freed me from my watery grave better now. Jacob had heard my desperate struggles. That was why he was running around the front yard, shouting blasphemies and obscenities and banging our only 2 pots together. My aunt was chasing him with a knife. Behind that, there was an ever-present cloud of cawing. The swarm of carrion birds blotted out the sun. I spilled out into the barn out back and slammed the big wooden door behind me, pushing some dust-coated farm equipment in front of the door. When the bang started at the door, I climbed into the loft and picked the corner with the least amount of spider webs. I shivered there for hours, blood drying on my face as my mind created shapes in the dark. I watched figures made of shadow dig their claws into the sides of the loft and pull themselves up, ready to devour me. I could feel the whispers of their fingers on my face. I didn't leave the barn until slivers of moonlight peeked in through the rotting wood slats. My clothes were still damp as I trudged over to one of my only friends in this damned place. My breath came out in frigid clouds as I focused on drawing air in and out. She tried to drown me. She tried to kill me. I was going to die. I collapsed against Frith's sturdy wooden support and began to sob. I can't go back inside. She'll do it again. She'll do it again. I'm gonna freeze out here. As I curled my knees into my chest and wailed in earnest, I felt something on my back. A thin scraping, like the comforting touch of a mother, but in all the wrong ways. In my periphery, I saw it. The end of a gnarled branch curled into knotted fingers. I couldn't move. The wind whistled around in the stalks of corn. It almost sounded like whispers. I launched off of the ground and ran around to the back of the house. Jacob sat there beside the crawl space door where he'd no doubt been hiding. He looked at me with a swollen black eye. Blood was caked onto his deep frown, and his nose bent just a little too far to the right. A long slash ran across his chin and jawline, a battle scar from saving my life. Guilt seized me for not coming to his aid. At that moment, I felt like a coward. She's gone insane. Dad isn't in his room. I think she might have killed him. She hadn't murdered our father, of course. He'd gone into town that day to look for work. He wanted to turn our lives around. But as children, suffering from the hands of an aunt in a murderous rage, there was little else we could come up with. I didn't tell Jacob about the scarecrow, how it had touched my back with its crackly tree hand and winked its marker eye at me. Too much was going on, and though I knew he would believe me, there was only so much a mind like his could stand. We snuck back into the house, Jacob pulling me along and whispering reassurances as we climbed the stairs, our feet as close to the wall as possible to avoid making the old wood creak. I could only breathe easy once we were in our room, and the door was locked. It was a small barrier between us and the mad woman that now wanted our blood spilled. But it was a barrier nonetheless. We have to run away. Dad can't save us now. Jacob was shoving things into a bag. I was still so tired and so very cold. I stripped out my damp sweater, desperate for dry warmth. Morning? Can't we wait until the morning? I whispered. Jacob looked at my way as I curled into the fetal position under the meager white blanket. His expression was heavy with a fight between fear and concern. Okay, morning. But then we have to go. I rubbed my eyes hard. We'll sleep in shifts. He paused before nodding quietly. Jacob coaxed me out of bed and helped me into my dry clothes, keeping his eye on the door as often as he could. My brother, my protector. You'd better wake me up. I mumbled as my eyes grew too heavy to stay open. He didn't respond, instead merely throwing his blanket over me and causing a deep shiver to rack me. The kind you get when the warmth is finally returning to your body. I knew he would end up letting me sleep. My dreams were plagued with dark visions. Twisting, animalistic bodies dipping in and out of shadows as I could hear the cries for help from my brother somewhere in the distance, accompanied by the wail of a discordant calliope. I shot upright in bed sometime in the early hours of the morning. Jacob lay against my bed. His breathing deepened in light sleep. Behind it, I could hear an odd sound. The creaking of the front door on its hinges, no doubt pushed by the wind. I slowly got to my feet and slid them across the wooden floor to the door. Against my better judgment, I disengaged our bedroom lock and slowly pushed the door open. The house was icy, and my shivers returned in full force. I coughed quietly into my hand as I came to the top of the stairs. As my bare feet descended the wooden steps as quietly as possible, I found myself reciting a prayer I'd heard whispered by my grandmother above my mother's pale body. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. I could hear thumps in the living room. It sounded like the movements of some sort of wild animal. Blessed art thou among women, blessed the fruit of thy womb. The air smelled sour like rotting plants and urine. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now. Terror seized my lungs, making it hard to breathe as I neared the bottom. And at the hour of our death, I reached the bottom step and peeked into the living room, holding my aunt above the floor as her pink slippered feet swung frantically was Frith. Its long, knotted branches hovered just in front of her face, and my aunt's skin looked paper white in the glow of the TV. How the scarecrow kept upright on its single support post, I couldn't tell you. Physics bent to the will of whatever this thing truly was. The burlap was pulled tight around whatever laid beneath it, and yellow eyes with wide black pupils bulged out of the rips. Swaths of rough brown fabric hung from the mouth and cheeks, revealing a mouth filled to near bursting with white, dinosauric teeth. Before I could so much as blink, the scarecrow sunk its makeshift claws into her neck. A fountain of blood erupted from her mouth and then everywhere else as it dragged its impossibly sharp digits through her neck like a sword through hot butter. Her headless body made a wet thump as it hit the floor. A small whimper escaped my mouth and the hare's head snapped to look at me. She'd deserved it, make no mistake. But in the moment, I felt no sense of satisfaction. All I felt was insurmountable fear. I shrieked as I flew up the stairs. I could hear Jacob jump to his feet and my body crashed into his as I flung myself into our room. Go, now! But we didn't have time to make it out the window. As the door opened, I flung Jacob towards my bed, and we scrambled underneath. We both heard the steady thumps as the monster I'd formerly known as Frith crept into our room. Pandora, Pandora, what is that? Jacob's voice was quiet and urgent. and I pressed his face into my chest. "Nothing, Jacob. Keep your eyes closed. Don't you look, okay?" He'd protected me. Now I was doing the same. It stood over my bed, staring down into my eyes with its wide, soulless ones as I held Jacob close to me. That was all I knew until the sun began to creep over the cornfields. Its eyes and mine. I didn't know whether or not it intended for me to meet the same fate as my aunt. As dawn ran its fingers through the hills and forests of Tennessee, the scarecrow broke our staring contest. As soon as it began to move, I squeezed my eyes shut tight. It leaned down, and with a wooden claw, it stroked my right cheek. A thin trickle of blood ran its way down my neck, but still, I remained frozen. It withdrew, and I heard the slow thumps of it retreated down the stairs and out the front door. I still have that scar. Despite the sun spilling into the room from the window, we didn't move from our spot under the bed. The terror and innocence both left my body in one great outpouring as the exhaustion of someone that's witnessed a murder took hold. I pulled Jacob closer as my eyes slipped closed. The sound of a scream woke me. It was the voice of a man, one I hadn't heard in so long. It was our father, our real father, not the ghost that had so long wandered through oaken floors of the farmhouse when we'd long since fallen into our beds. Before Jacob and I could fully get out from under the bed, he'd flung up the stairs and thrown open our door. His face was flushed, and his eyes were full of a vibrant sort of terror. The kind only a father who's seen dark blood staining the floor all the way to the back door, and his sister and children nowhere to be found, could feel. He was alive again, grief stamped out like a dying fire pit by fresh air. "Kids, are you okay?" I hated seeing him so worried, but running into his outstretched arms felt like rising from the grave. Things moved extremely fast after that. Police were called. The farmhouse was cordoned off with yellow tape that whipped in the late November wind. The cornfield where one scarecrow had gone AWOL was stripped bare. We found a temporary home in a shitty little inn on Main Street. The sanctioned search for my aunt didn't last long. On the third day, everyone went to sleep, and when they brought their trucks back and assembled their grids, they made a grisly discovery. My father refused to tell me what had been found until I was much older. Sitting on top of the pole where Frith had once been was my aunt's severed head. Her milky eyes still filled with a cosmic sort of horror, like she'd seen the very devil she preached so adamantly about. Laid out on the ground in front of it was a blood-soaked Bible, the same Bible that my aunt had made us read innumerable times. Every single line of text in the entire Bible was indecipherable, except for one verse. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Shortly after that, we were packing things away into boxes and loading them into our father's truck. After some light pressing, my brother admitted to our father what our aunt had done to us. There were many emotions, and all of them crowded over one another for center stage. Despair at losing his sister, really losing her, in a way that death can't hold a candle to. Guilt for not seeing the bruises on Jacob or the unspoken pleas in our eyes on the rare occasions he'd leave his room. Sadness that the love of his life was not here to advise him on where to go next or what to do now. But the greatest of there was rage. A boiling fury at the attempted murder of his children at the hands of someone he trusted. That anger has never fully gone away. We left town 2 days before the funeral. To this day, Frith's motives are still unclear to me. It's possible that the scarecrow was some sort of unorthodox protector. I'd been an only friend to it, and it was returning the favor. Maybe it was never something to be feared, but sometimes I find myself looking up places I've been in the early hours of the morning, and Google takes me to that little town. Each time I see the slowly increasing amount of missing persons reports, it's hard not to feel that Frith was a hair of a darker color. I will always remember Brina's smile. She was the sweetest girl known to man, no doubt about it. I regret every single day that I couldn't keep my pride and joy safe from the creature that took her. I was a single father up until the day my little girl went missing. Her mother, my beloved wife, Deirdre, packed up and disappeared as soon as she got out of the hospital, not even thinking to tell me why. I thought it was horrible how she could just up and abandon her own daughter. For the first year after she left, I would kneel by my bed, holding a picture of her and praying to whatever gods were up there for her to come back. I missed her so much, especially her gorgeous red hair and twinkling green eyes. She was the best woman I had ever met, and I would go to hell and back for her to return. God, now I realize I should have stayed far away from her in the first place. The days passed slowly for the first few months. Being a parent to a newborn is rough, especially when you're doing it all on your own. We survived though, and Brina grew from a small bundle in my arms to a growing little girl. She was always smiling or laughing, some kind of joy always present in her glowing face. Noise filled the house when she got older, usually the sounds of her playing with her massive collection of dolls. The day she was taken was by far the worst day of my life. I had put her down for a small nap while I tried to get some chores done. I was busying myself with the dishes when I heard her. Brina was giggling quietly. I sighed as I trudged upstairs to tell her to go to sleep, but when I got outside of her room, the giggling stopped. "I know you're awake, Bree." I tried to speak, but her name got caught in my throat as I laid my eyes on it. She was towering over Brina's bed, cradling my daughter in its arms. Its form was tall and skeletal. The skin stretched over it a sort of grayish green. Its hair was long and red. Its clothing a mash of moss-colored robes. There were decaying dragonfly wings on its back, faintly fluttering. The door gave a particularly loud squeak as I pushed it open. The thing turned to look at me. As its paralyzing gaze bored into mine, I could swear its eyes were the exact same as Deirdre's. I could only stand and watch as the creature hid Brina under its robes. It jumped out of the window and took flight, leaving my line of sight inhumanly fast. As soon as it left, I was released from its hold, and I sprinted to the window. I leaned halfway out, looking everywhere to find my kid. I searched for a full half hour before I realized I had to call the police. I still feel bad for the poor 911 dispatcher who had to answer my frantic call. The police interrogated me for hours. Their questions and probing seemed to never end, each question wrenching my heart as they kept on trying to find anything to pin the blame on me. They kept on insisting they knew I didn't do it, but I could tell they were lying. I told them about the creature, but the only thing they had to offer was the number of my town's only psychiatrist. They searched for months on end, each one turning up empty-handed. After 7 months, I came to the realization that I would never see my daughter again. I started to shut myself off from the world. There wasn't much purpose to my life now that my baby girl was gone. I barely ate, never talked to anyone, and my curtains were always closed. 5 months later, I wasn't leaving the house for weeks on end. I had become just a shell of the man I once was. On the anniversary of her disappearance, I went out searching again. I knew it would be a fruitless effort, but I couldn't stop myself. Just once more, I thought, just to make sure. The trees hung over me, as if they were trying to block any light from reaching the ground. The wind was whipping wildly, and I almost mistook it for a banshee. I walked for what felt like miles until I found it. I had almost stopped paying attention in my search when I tripped over what I thought was a particularly large rock sticking out of the ground. I tumbled to the ground and landed with a thud. As I looked behind me to see the rock, my heart almost stopped. Laying in the ground was a rotting baby doll. My daughter's rotting baby doll. The one she had been clutching onto when I put her down for her nap that day. I stared at it, the muck-covered eye poking out of a barely covered hole in the ground. And then I started to dig. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I would do anything, and I mean anything, to get Brina back, even if it meant digging to the core of the earth itself. She was the light of my life, and I had been without her for too long. With enough digging, I reached a tunnel. Well, it was less of a tunnel and more of a hole with a light at the end, descending into some kind of underground world. I followed it without hesitation, plunging myself into the unknown realm. I landed in a place that could only be described with the grandiose flourish of an old fantasy author. There was not enough words in the English language to describe how beautiful the world I was in was, but I knew instantly that I was unwelcome. There was warmth everywhere, but the pit of my stomach was ice cold. Brina was here. I just knew it. The path led to some kind of grand room full of music and dancing. I quietly followed it, not wanting to alert any of the creatures there. As soon as I got to the entrance, I started to regret my decision. There were so many creatures almost identical to the one that had taken my daughter. All of them were tall, thin, and their skin looked the color of rot. I could spot the one that had broken in the center of the room. It was swaying in a circle, cradling something in its arms. I could hear my daughter's soft giggling, but it sounded almost forced. I crept along the walls trying to get a better look. Brina was with that creature, and she looked on the verge of tears. Then the creature spoke. I know you miss your father, but you have us now, and we'll love you and keep you safe forever and ever. I almost gasped in shock at the voice. It was Deirdre. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I knew my wife. Even after 6 years of radio silence, I knew her hair and her eyes and her voice, and that creature was either her or making a perfect mimicry of her. Brina didn't look like she was swayed by her mother's words, and she continued to pout until she saw me. Daddy, she yelled, scrambling from the monster running towards me. That's when they noticed me. At first, it was silence. I stared at the one who stole my daughter, and she stared back. When Brina reached me, she pounced. A surge of them rushed toward me as I took my daughter into my arms. I panicked and reacted before my brain had time to process it. I dashed out of the room. I could hear the roar of the woman thing behind me as I ran down the path. Give me back my baby. I came up to the hole in the ground and started to climb. When I was halfway up, she grabbed my ankle, pulling me down. Brina screeched. I tried to comfort her as best as I could, but I was much more focused on trying to get away from that thing claiming to be her mother. As I was struggling to get out of her grasp, Brina fell silent. She reached for the iron ring I kept around my ring finger and ripped it off before throwing it at the beast. She yelled and let go, falling to the ground. I scrambled out of the hole, clutching Brina tightly. I sprinted out of the woods and back to the house. I didn't even bother to cover up the hole I had left. The door slammed shut behind us as I rushed into the house, instantly running from window to window, making sure they were locked. When I finished, I came back to the couch where I had put Brina. "What happened, baby? What were those things?" I asked. I was almost on the verge of tears, but I had to keep it cool. "That was Mommy's family," she said, looking at me with an innocent stare. It's been several hours now, and I haven't let Brina out of my sight. There's iron and salt on all of the doors and windows now. I hope to God they don't come back, but my instincts tell me otherwise. I couldn't protect my daughter a year ago, but I will this time, even if it kills me. I've always been a bit of a lurker, but I'm coming to the one place I think can help me now. Something's seriously wrong in my hometown. I've always been an explorer, and after having spent most of my younger years being raised and educated in Ohio, I struck out on my own. After 5 years in DC and almost 1 year in Florida, I've been relatively happy with my choices, but I do miss Ohio in the fall time. Cold weather and all. My family all lives in Tuscarawas County, which is a small county about an hour south of Akron, so it's never an issue when I want to go home for long periods of time. And after living on an island most of the year, it's nice to go somewhere that has a large landmass for me to explore and hike and whatnot. Which brings us to 2 weeks ago when I called my mom and asked if she'd be willing to put me up for a week so I can come see friends. She, being a typical mother, happily obliged. We talked about the comings and goings of small-town Dover, Ohio, and the typical neighbor gossip when she said, "The area is just changing." Me, being from there, dismissed it. Something was always going to happen, but it never quite materialized in my small hometown. I drove up a week later. Happy to be home and seeing family and friends, I spent the first 2 days bouncing all around the country. But one night I couldn't sleep and I hopped in the Jeep and decided to take a night drive. Driving like a bat out of hell across those winding roads till I ended up back in town. I stopped at the local Circle K for a pop. This is the first time I noticed something off. As I walked out of Circle K and into the parking lot, I noticed a man standing in his front yard next to the Circle K, just standing there staring straight ahead at the empty street in front of him. I assumed he maybe had AirPods on or something, but he made no noise. Just stood, never once turning his head. I brushed this off and of course hopped in my Jeep. Once started, the radio blared to life louder than I had remembered having it. I turned it down and once again looked around the man. He was still standing, but his head had shifted to the left, and he was now staring at my car, staring at me. I could feel it. Needless to say, I noped out of there really quickly and got to my mom's. Convinced myself that it was just a weird guy and fell asleep. The next day I happened to drive past the house again and the man was gone, though I half expected him to find him there, still staring ahead. I told myself to quit being paranoid and just enjoy my time here. 2 nights later I was at my sister's and we were talking about it. I told her about the man I had seen and, to my surprise, she said the same thing my mother had said weeks earlier. "Yeah, Zach, the area is changing." I asked her what she meant, and all she said was, Just is. After a bit more catching up, I hopped in the Jeep again and took off to Mom's. Driving through town late at night was always peaceful as the roads were usually barren, bearing the occasional late night driver or two. You tend to zone out except for when you see the random red lights. Something felt off and uneasy though to me. I came to a red light and that's when I saw them. The houses lining the streets on the block before me had people standing in front of them. At least one person in front of every single house. All of them standing in their front lawns, uniform, staring straight ahead. I turned off the radio and rolled down the window and slowed down in front of one of the houses where two people, a man and a woman, stood. "You guys okay?" I managed to say. Nothing. "What's going on?" I stammered, trying to put some bass in my voice. Still nothing. Their eyes weren't even focused on me, just staring straight ahead. Their heads didn't even move. Fuck this, I thought and sped off. Further down the road I went, desperately trying to get to my mom's and shake the creepiness factor. However, as I continued and turned off the main street, I noticed that more people were out in front of their homes. It wasn't every house, but probably 1 out of every 3. All of them staring straight ahead. To my relief, my mother's street was not experiencing this. I ran into the house. "Mom, you've got to get up. Something's going on." "Zach, it's 12:30. What could possibly be going on?" I told her the story and she looked at me incredulously, and it was obvious she didn't believe me. I begged her to come with me and I could show her. I finally coaxed her out and we got in the Jeep and I went to areas where I had seen the people. No one was there. The streets deserted like they usually were at this hour. My mom was annoyed and complained about being pulled out of bed. I told her I knew what I had seen and it was weird and something felt off in this town. "Zach, the area is changing," she said coldly, almost as if it wasn't in her voice. I asked her what that meant, but she gave the same answer my sister had hours earlier. "Just is." I pressed her for more, but she didn't say anything until we got back to her home. She told me goodnight and went to bed. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off, and I felt as though those people were still out there. The next morning, I left for Cleveland as planned, to see some friends over the course of 2 days. I stopped at Speedway to get gas that morning, and was tired due to lack of sleep the night before. I went in for coffee and, to my surprise, the man standing behind the counter was the same man I had seen at the start of all of this. I froze, unable to move. Does he recognize me? I thought. No, there's no way. I walked up with my coffee and he looked at me before asking, "Anything else?" "No," I stammered. He was different, fidgeting and tapping his fingers on the counter. So much movement compared to who I saw the first night. I had to say something, anything to him. I had to know if he knew me. "Hey man, I think I saw you the other night," I managed to blurt out, my eyes avoiding his. "Where at?" he asked. "I think I saw you standing outside your house the other night around 11:30. I barely muttered. "Nah, man, couldn't have been me. I open the store and I go to bed pretty early," he replied. "Must have been someone else," I managed to say, not really believing it. This was sure as shit the same guy. "Lots of new people moving here, man. Don't know the whole town like I used to. The area is changing, that's for sure." As he said it, his eyes got very distant for a moment before shifting back to his cheerful demeanor. The words sent chills down my spine. What the fuck was going on? My sister, my mom, now this guy, all had the same reaction with the exact same words. I grabbed my coffee and got out of there, ignoring his, "Have a good one, brother," as I walked out the door. Being in Cleveland was wonderful for those 2 days, and I felt as though I had a giant weight lifted off my shoulders. Life was normal again. My college friends and I went to the Cavs game, hung out and drank ourselves stupid, and overall had a great time. All of those weird experiences, while in the back of my mind, felt like a distant memory. Which brings us to tonight. My mom called me around 4 and asked if I was heading home. I told her I'd still be there tonight, but she could leave the door unlocked in case I leave late. I told her I'd text her when I left Cleveland prior to the 2-hour drive. I felt a bit of paranoia leaving the city. Something's off back home, right? Is my mind playing tricks on me? I did my best to push the feeling down, but I couldn't shake it. This ominous sense of dread as I rolled down I-77 to a place that now terrified me. I pulled off the interstate and onto the exit around 11:30. My anxiety was borderline overwhelming, like this impending sense of dread. I went past the gas stations and turned back into the town towards my mom's place, and I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Every house had people in front of it, all of them standing lockstep in their front lawns. I couldn't believe it. It was as if the road was a red carpet and they were lining it for me and my Jeep to drive down. No one moved. No one even acknowledged the car as it rolled down the street. They all just stared straight ahead. "I have to get to my mom and sister's now," I said, speeding through the quiet streets. The faces not acknowledging me. Just the same blank stares. Fathers, mothers, children. Everyone just staring straight ahead. What was this? Why the fuck are all these people out here? I finally came to my mom's street and I saw what I dreaded most. Her and my stepfather were in front of their home, like all the others, standing there, straight-eyed at the street. I got out of the car and onto the street slowly, almost as if I was afraid a sudden movement would cause the various neighbors to descend upon me. Hell, even my own parents. Who knows what the fuck this is? "Mom, are you okay?" I asked in a hushed voice. "Tim?" Nothing. They just stared straight ahead. I was so scared in that moment. What was causing this? Why don't they acknowledge me? Jesus Christ, I'm her own son. Terrified and shocked, I grabbed my mom by the shoulders. "We gotta get the fuck out of here now," I screamed. She blinked. The first movement I had seen. Her head jerked sideways almost inquisitively, as if she was trying to sort what was happening. She opened her mouth and let out a slight gravelly breath. "The area is changing," she whispered. It wasn't her voice. It was a guttural, gravelly voice. Suddenly I heard the sound of movement and the entire street was looking at me. All at once they opened their mouth and let out a wail. It sounded like... There's no way to describe it. Dozens of wails from these people. These neighbors. Like dozens of people were all crying out in agony. And the sound kept increasing. Almost as if the whole neighborhood was all crying out in a tortured scream. I ran across the front yard as fast as I could away from my own mother and jumped in the car and sped off. The radio off as I heard my Jeep speed down the road. But all of their voices projecting out this torturous noise. I have never heard anything like that, and I pray I never will again. I jumped on the interstate and got the hell out of there. I drove for an hour to Akron and checked into a hotel where I am writing this. I don't know what to do. Do I go back in the daytime? Do I call the police? I have to do something. My whole fucking family is there. I tried calling my sisters and no one answers. I hope they're safe, but I dare not attempt to go get them now. Not until daylight. The area may be changing, but I'll be damned if my family is going to change with it. Entry number 215, August 13th, 2021, 5 p.m. The frigid hellscape lay bare yet inescapable as far as the eye could see, in all directions, and was blocked only by the towering rock formations to the south, on which my custom snowmobile had crashed. Miraculously unharmed, I fled the wreckage on foot in the same direction I had been going on the vehicle, which was back to camp, due north and a bit west from the wreck. This entry takes a drastic turn in the subject and tone of writing in this journal, with my previous entries mostly consisting of nothing more than notes on the mating habits of penguins and other Antarctic birds, as relates to my 6-person research team's field of study, for I am left alone in the middle of this snowy wasteland after having been caught in a snowstorm well away from our camp. Indeed, the storm blew my snowmobile far off track from my course, and I since changed direction numerous times on my return trip back to camp. I had attempted to reach my group through the usage of a long-distance communicator, but the device was blown out of my clumsy gloved hand by the high winds, leaving me without any mode of communication. Most definitely the greatest setback of all was the destruction of my only method of vehicular transport, the mobile, thus forcing me to resume my trek on foot. Entry number 216, August 13th, 2021, 7:30 p.m. I have now learned, since the recent debating of the storm revealed new rocky protrusions that I would have recognized if they existed anywhere near the camp, and also the fact that on my return trip, I changed directions numerous times and traveled over 3 times the distance that I did on my outbound excursion, that I am completely lost in the middle of the Antarctic wasteland. I am left with very few provisions. I expected such a short voyage would call for none, and far from enough clothing to survive indefinitely in such frigid temperatures. This document is a scientific journal, reserved for scientific research and documentation of my personal accounts while conducting this research, and therefore, I will not be explicitly clear in my extreme panic when confronted with such a disturbing reality. I will therefore allow you to assume at my overwhelming distress, rather than rant about it in terms that very well might not do my emotions justice. With me, I do have a thin sleeping bag and small foldable tent. I retrieved them from the cargo of the snowmobile after it wrecked, which I intended to use to make a makeshift structure. Without such a shelter from the elements, albeit a poor one, I would certainly make this place my grave. Yet, about half an hour ago, where I first thought I was going to pitch my tent, I came upon a strange object that previously had assumed was some sort of short rock formation. Indeed, this was no rock formation. It was a quite average-looking wooden door. The wood is evidently fir from the somewhat grainy texture, and was stained a dark brown. It is complete with a frame that was stained a similar color. The doorknob was made of brass. I traced a circle around the wooden thing, and it was clearly not connected to any sort of aperture. It appeared as if someone had just dropped it there in the snow, where it stood erect and straight, as if it was enabled to stand on its own by being fastened to the ground itself. I was going to brush some of the snow collecting around the base aside in order to check how such an object stood on its own, but an incredible feeling washed over me that cautioned me against it. Indeed, when I first recognized the door, I was profoundly relieved and comforted by its presence. I suppose the feeling when being accompanied, even by an inanimate object, in the face of such desolation is rather hard to describe. Certainly, I was relieved at first that I would not have to spend the night feeling as if I was completely alone. However, such feelings have since gone away to emotions such as the one that prevented me from further investigating or even opening the curious gate, or even my current holding of dread at the thing, which made me decide to move my tent some 200 feet away from the door. For, in spite of my newfound accompaniment, the structure's presence begged the question, how did it end up here? Certainly I could not answer, and the more I thought about the absurdity of its attendance, the further my fear of the thing increased, until I could no longer bring myself to think of it, I dare say, as a wholly material object. As I say this, I reflect and see that I am now ranting, perhaps from fatigue or cold. It's time for me to rest. I will resume my entries tomorrow. Entry number 217, August 14th, 2021, 11 a.m. Upon waking, a chill ran down my frigid spine as I observed the obviously purposeful object in the distance. It stood silhouetted by the morning sun, which wheeled low around the horizon every day and never set, as if it was here at the poles. I consumed a small portion of my meager rations and worked up the energy to attempt exercise, such that I might keep my body warm, but after a time my hypothermic limbs could no longer bear the strain of prolonged movement, and I was resigned to conserve my energy in my tent. The walls of the tent were thin enough that even though through them I could still observe the ever-watching form of the phantom structure meeting my gaze from its vantage point in my snow. I really wasn't sure what was worse, to rest with it in plain view, or to roll around and bear the eerie feeling of leaving myself vulnerable to an object very possibly not of this world. I will follow up this account in my next entry. Now I will rest. Entry number 218, August 14th, 2021, 1 p.m. I am now positively sure that this object must surely have some malevolent purpose. Upon waking from my slumber, I was still able to identify its ominous form standing amidst the silence of the icy plains, beckoning with some unnatural medium that I travel through it to observe the unknown evil waiting on the other side. No, I will resist its pull. Oh God, what is this blasphemous thing? And what on earth did this wretch do to deserve such a horrible fate? For the door is now oscillating and stretching in my view, expanding to great heights and lengths and drawing ever nearer my tent as it goes. It is changing its color to many uncanny and indescribable hues, and before I can begin to register one in my mind, it rapidly switches to another, even more disturbing shade. Always it calls to me, speaking in tongues, beckoning that I may come and reveal the hellish secrets locked behind its deceivingly simple wooden paneling. Over 200 feet of snow separated me from the door yesterday. Now, the warping abomination lay not 2 meters from the opening flap of my tent. The knob can now be seen clearly, twisting and warping in its dimensions, but it cannot open on its own. The voice assures me my suffering will end when I open the door. Entry number 219, August 14th, 2021, 1:20 p.m. There is beyond our world a gulf of light upon which rests the Nameless on his throne of stars. Soon he will bring upon the earth a veil of night shadowing all under his grasp of darkness. I know indeed, for I have opened the door, and it revealed to me the apocalypse doomed to come. The veil creeps outward from the door, melting the snow and scalding the earth, demonstrating that the voice's words to me were indeed true, for he, I am sure it was indeed him who spoke, said that what I saw through that wondrous wooden frame was no vision or glimpse, but it was indeed a gate through time, to a future where he and his minions had raised mankind's greatest cities and established a brand new world far greater than any that has been before. I know this just not from such a ring of melting ice, but also from the dark silhouette stooping over to pass through the gate. I wept as he opened the flap to my tent, and his voice, before only a primordial whisper coming from that door, loudened into a beautiful scream that spoke all the secrets of the new earth to come. I wept as it stroked my dying body with its fingers, black as night yet bright as a star. It watches me write these words while I drift off into eternal slumber from the cold and hunger. And I pray only that my team may find this journal and spread the word that we are, indeed, not alone in the universe. This was the journal of one Stephen Johannesburg, who left our research base on the 13th to track down a penguin family that had been spotted on one of our cameras. He told us via his communicator that he never found the penguins, and around the same time we lost contact with Johannesburg after a violent snowstorm. Afterward, we were still unable to contact Stephen via the transponder. Our team assumed the worst and began a search via helicopter. We didn't find him until 3 p.m. on the 14th. His mangled body was found gored on a rock outcropping on which his snowmobile had been wrecked. There was no doubt that his body had been killed immediately on impact, and the layer of snow covering his coat alongside the qualities of the body proved that he had died during the snowstorm on the 13th. We buried Stephen in the snow next to where the crash had occurred. A search for the contents of the snowmobile's cargo and Johannesburg's body showed that the tent and sleeping bag belonging to Stephen were missing, and these items could not be found for another hour until we eventually located his tent in the middle of a flat, glaciated outcropping. Inside we found the missing and rather peculiarly warm sleeping bag. Perhaps even stranger was the presence of a rather battered-looking wooden door laying flat on the snow a few feet from the tent. Despite its eeriness, the door was rather standard in appearance, and nothing out of the ordinary happened when it was opened or shut. It wasn't until we began to tear down and repack his makeshift camp that we found Stephen's research journal inside of his sleeping bag, along with the pencil he used to write in it. The 3 most recent entries, which are listed above, were extremely haunting and verging on the paranormal. The dates listed are more recent than the 13th of August, when Stephen died, but Johannesburg had a very unique and unmistakable style of handwriting, and the likes of the 3 most recent entries were no exception. Even though Stephen had no previous history of mental decay, it is apparent, especially in the final entry of the journal, that Johannesburg had lost his wits and gone quite insane. But this offers no answer to the unexplainable presence of the tent or the ominous dating of the notebook drafts, nor does it offer any clues to the eerie presence of the obscure wooden door. In spite of all of this, I think the 2 things that truly forced my hand in publicizing this document were the large ring of melted snow extending from out of the door on the ground and the existence of a disturbingly relevant handprint, far larger and with longer digits than a normal man's, on the dusting of snow covering the tent flap. When I met Ava, she was the perfect match for me. We met in a park quite a while ago. When I decided to go for an early morning jog, Ava was sitting on a bench, eyes glued to her phone. At the time, I wasn't very fit, so after a few laps, I plonked myself down next to her. She looked up and smiled at me, and I hesitantly smiled back. We got talking, and after a while, we exchanged numbers. I told her that I lived locally, and I found out that she did too. We even found out that we had the same favorite food, pizza. We chatted for a while, and it seemed like we had hit off. We texted each other later that day and arranged a date in the town. Ever since then, we've been together, girlfriend and boyfriend. Before her, I'd never dated anyone. Neither had she, so I always joked that our relationship was fate. But not everything in our relationship is perfect. For one, Ava has serious trust issues. I found this out on one of our first dates when I tried to hold her hand. However, I didn't manage to, as Ava jerked her hand away from me like I was poisonous. Oh yeah, Jim, I forgot to tell you. I don't really like being touched. I didn't think that was too odd, as I knew a lot of people who didn't like physical affection. This complicated our relationship slightly as I couldn't kiss or hug her, but other than that, we were just like any other couple. There have been occasions where I'd forget that she didn't like it and try and touch her, but she was too quick. For someone who always looked half dead, I was surprised to find she had so much energy. Oh yeah, and that's the other thing. Ava isn't exactly very healthy. She's very thin, and there are days where I can almost see her bones through her translucent skin. Her long black hair falls loosely in greasy strands, and the dark circles under her eyes make her look like a panda. And then there are her eyes themselves. They are dark hollows, void of emotion or anything human. Ava's skin is so white it looks almost green. If you met her at night, you would think she was a corpse. I've nagged her to go see a doctor, but she refuses. I'm hoping that this is just a seasonal thing. Maybe she'll get better when summer starts again, but that is a long way away yet. It's early November and the advancing cold weather probably won't help. Still, I love her no matter what. We're soulmates after all. This was meant to be. Another thing I hate about Ava is how secretive she is. About everything. I try and tell her that she can trust me. We're dating after all, but she doesn't listen. She gets so mad when I try and question her. I don't know what she does in the time between our dates. I just assume she's busy with work and ignore it. One time, however, my friend Mark and I were walking through the neighborhood when we saw Ava in a graveyard. She was with another guy, and trust me when I say I've never seen two people who look so alike yet so different at the same time. This guy had this exact same complexion as her, the same hollow cheeks and dead eyes. But his face structure was completely different, and while she was long and lanky, he was short and stocky. When I saw him, I stumbled backwards, and I must have made quite a racket, as his glassy eyes stopped fixating on Ava and stared directly at me. Well, that was it. I grabbed Mark's arm and ran. I didn't want Ava to know that we'd been spying on her. I tried, indirectly questioning her over dinner, but she completely denied all of it. So you can imagine my surprise when she showed up at my flat yesterday and told me that we were going to her parents' house. She seemed oddly nervous and quite jittery. I agreed to go, and we set off on foot to their place. It was quite dark outside. There was no moon that night, which meant that the neighborhood was shrouded in darkness. It was also quite cold, and I shivered as I pulled my coat tighter around me. Ava didn't seem to feel the cold, though, as she strode on without acknowledging it. We walked in the dark for about 15 minutes before Ava stopped and said, "This is the place." She had stopped at the local cemetery, the one where I'd seen her talking to her doppelganger. I stared at it for a minute before I asked, "Is this where your parents live?" "Yes," she said quietly, walking over to a corner of the cemetery. I assumed they were dead. "I'm sorry," I called after her, racing to keep up. Oh, don't be. She smiled. Tonight we're going to bring them back. At least, we're going to bring Mom back. Dad is already here. She turned around and there stood the short guy from a while back. He had a sack slung over his shoulder, big enough for a human, but I didn't dare question it. In the gloom, he looked more corpse-like than ever, and when he smiled, you could see his rotting teeth. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He's your dad? That's right, she confirmed. I brought him back a few weeks ago, when you and your friend just happened to be passing by us. Her words were laced with venom, and I felt waves of guilt crashing over me. How? You can't bring back the dead. Ava smiled sweetly, chuckling at my ignorance. You'll see. Dig. She handed me a shovel and nudged me towards her mother's grave. Wait, you want me to? She nodded. I sighed and plunged my shovel into the ground. I could feel their empty eyes boring into me as I dug, making me feel uncomfortable. It didn't look like I had much choice in the matter. After 30 minutes of digging, I had dug quite a big hole, but it wasn't deep enough. The corpse of Ava's mother still lay somewhere far below. This was going to be exhausting work. This is crazy, I exclaimed, throwing down my shovel. You can't make me do this. Ava just rolled her eyes. Dad, I think he needs some more motivation. Ava's dad ripped open the sack he had been carrying, shook it, and out tumbled Mark. He had been bound and gagged, and there was a blindfold over his eyes so he couldn't see anything. Mark, what did they do to you? I cried, running over to him. A bony hand shot out and flung me to the ground. I knew it was Ava's dad, as Ava hated being touched. If you stop digging, the boy dies. He growled, shaking his fist at me. I tried to scream, but he clamped a fist over my mouth. The smell of rotting flesh made my eyes water. Dig, he said, squeezing Mark's throat. I picked up the shovel and began digging faster. Dirt flew everywhere as I dug, sprinkling the graveyard in soil. Occasionally, I would stop, but not for too long, as Ava's dad would remind me why I was digging. Hours passed. 2 hours. 3 hours. Finally, my shovel hit something. I unearthed it and saw it was a hand. A withered, green hand. I started feeling nauseous and stopped digging. Is this enough? I asked, praying that it would be. Just a little bit more, Jim. You're doing great. Ava beamed. The compliment was enough. I dug slightly deeper and exposed the torso. That will be fine, Jim. A deep voice behind me made me jump. Ava's dad had snuck up behind me while I was digging. Let me take it from here. He approached the body and crouched down beside it. In one single movement, he had ripped off a whole chunk of flesh. He chewed it and grinned contentedly, opening his mouth so I could see the grotesque thing he was eating. Is that all I did this for? I wrinkled up my nose, repulsed. I felt like I was going to vomit. Well, no, not exactly, Ava's dad said. Haven't you ever watched a horror movie, my boy? Don't you know what happens next? A light switch flicked on in my brain. Everything made so much sense now. You're zombies, I said. This was the reason why Ava didn't want to touch me. The reason why she looked half dead. She was dead. They were dead. They were zombies. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, to escape while I still could. But the rational side of me told me that this couldn't be real. They can't be zombies, I thought to myself. Zombies aren't real. They're just some story made up to scare kids. Ava seemed to know what I was thinking as she smirked and said, "Want proof?" Before I could answer, she strode over to Mark and ripped him to shreds. I watched in frozen horror, mesmerized as she tore my best friend apart and chowed down his flesh. It seemed like pizza wasn't her favorite food after all. "First good meal I've had in a long time," she sighed. "It's a pity he wasn't dead. He would have tasted so much better." I stared at her in disbelief. "What?" she snapped, noticing me. "Nothing," I muttered. I slided back over to the body of Ava's mom. "What happens next?" "Oh, to her?" Ava said. I nodded. "Over the next 24 hours, my mom's heart will start beating. The zombie venom will start flowing through her body and her brain will be shocked into working again. So basically, she'll become an animated corpse. A zombie," Ava said conversationally, like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Like you," I said, watching her in distaste. "Yes, like me. And like Dad. And you too, if you just let me." She pounced on me, and I remember trying to shake her off. The last thing I saw were her rotten teeth before she plunged them into my flesh, and I blacked out. Right now, as I'm typing this, I am bound to my bed. My body throbs with pain, and I have been throwing up every few minutes. I'm a sticky mess. Sweat sticking my hair to my forehead. Ava says my skin has turned gray and that I am beginning to reek of death. I think that means it will all be over soon. I hope so. I can't stand another few hours like this. This is the sickest I have ever felt. I just want to get some rest, but I can't when I feel like this. Ava says it must be worse for me because I am still alive, and she's right. I know that the transformation is almost complete as I feel like a fog has come over my brain and my vision is worsening. I can't wait for this to be over, because then Ava and I can finally become a real couple and be intimate with one another. I know I'll look disgusting when this transformation is over, but that's alright. We can be together forever now, just like in the movies. There's another good thing, though. At least I won't have to buy a Halloween costume this year. Want to date my daughter? That's the question I saw headlining a flyer posted to a telephone pole. I was curious enough that I had to stop and read it. Here it is, exactly as it was written. Want to date my daughter. Wanted. Understanding person who is respectful and attentive between the age of 18 to 30 to date my daughter. Timpani. Yes, I'm making a personal ad for my daughter. I know that's a little strange, but I'm protective and she's a delicate girl. Anyone interested must be able to follow all my rules. Timpani is a great girl. Really funny, really smart, and gentle, but very shy. I'm not going to say she's beautiful because every parent thinks their children is beautiful, but also because if that's all you care about, then you're not the right kind of person. There are 8 rules for dating my daughters, but they're definitely not simple. 1. Always arrive to your date on time and ring the doorbell. I can't stress this enough. Punctuality is absolutely key, and even being a second late to a scheduled hangout with my daughter is a definite no-no. 2. Wear some combination of white, orange, and green. It can be as much or as little as you want. Quantity doesn't matter, and neither does location. She'll know. 3. Introduce yourself backwards. You can turn around once she's gotten a good look at you. 4. Always make eye contact with your eyes. It doesn't matter which one, as long as you're maintaining eye contact when talking. 5. You can never drink too much vinegar. It's really good for your digestive system, but the effect it'll have on your breath is also very important. It'll make the kiss at the end of the night much easier. 6. Do not take her to any of the following. Restaurants whose names start with a P. Anywhere that goes nuts for anything. Buildings located on odd-numbered streets. Rooms with more than 15 60-watt light bulbs. Anywhere with bodies of water. Factory outlet stores. And places that smell strongly of pine. 7. Don't neglect her other side. Timpani should get 1/3 of your attention, and the others the rest. Or else it'll be a bad day. Failing number 6. Remove one of your teeth and place it by their left foot. You can do whatever you want with the blood. 8. Last but not least, if you step away, tie their leg down to something first. The last time this didn't happen, we got into huge trouble with the city. Call me at serious inquiries only. I was interested, not in a date, but seeing what kind of a train wreck this really was. I took a photo and called as soon as I got home. Robert answered, his voice shaky and nervous and stern all at once. Our phone call felt like an interrogation. You saw the rules? Yeah. What's number 2? Orange, white, and green. Friday at 6:01. Remember rule number 1. He said before quickly rattling off an address. I was giddy with excitement when he hung up on me, laughing to myself as I wondered about what I was going to experience. I went to a thrift store to buy something orange and ended up with a black t-shirt with a leprechaun on it, which I figured met all of the criteria in one, but just in case, I planned to wear a nice white shirt over it just to make sure I had enough. I had a thought and checked out the electronics too, finding exactly what I wanted. I recorded myself on my new tape recorder as I walked home, making sure it worked. I needed something I could keep on me, proof of what I was sure was going to be a date beyond belief that I could share with my friends and laugh about together over drinks. The next day came around, and I arrived early to the house. I stood outside and lifted my hand to knock, but the door opened before I could touch wood. Someone, who I could only guess was Robert by his fatherly appearance, held the door open, his body filling the frame. He glared at me, a flock of curly, dark hair atop his head. He was tall, neither lanky nor brawny, just a tall, average-looking man with a hint of danger in his eyes. I reached into my pocket and depressed the play button on my tape recorder. "You're early," he said, his voice kind of quivering. I smiled. "Right, you said punctuality was key." "Punctual means exact." His eyes darted to the left, and he turned his head to look over his shoulder. A moment later, he looked back at me. The doorbell wasn't rung. Maybe she won't notice if we talk together for a few minutes. He nodded his head and beckoned me in. I stepped in tentatively. Robert walked me through a dark hallway before we entered a small sitting area in front of a fireplace. He sat in a leather armchair, I across from him in a dining chair. A bright light behind him obscured my vision and cast him in shadows. He was just an oppressive outline in the chair. On the mantel of the fireplace was a statue, an Indian one I could tell, with all the usual motifs I had seen from their gods. 3 heads, multiple arms, etc. But I wasn't sure which god it represented. The whole room kind of looked like it could have been in a Pier 1 import showroom. It was pretty tacky. As Robert began to talk, I realized the nervous lilt to his voice was natural for him, and belied his stern demeanor. He sounded like he was a whipped dog, but there was an underlying intimidation to his quivering voice. One that made me think he could be a closet serial killer, and I'd just made a huge mistake. "Did you follow all the rules?" he asked. I was able to pick up the hint of a New York accent. The Bronx, maybe. I nodded. "Of course. I respect your rules, sir." "Good. I want this to go smoothly. I have high hopes that you'll be the one." The one? My baby has a hard time finding someone who can follow the rules, but they're absolutely important." He shook his head. "You probably think I'm crazy or something." "No, sir, of course not," I said, holding back laughter. Robert crossed his legs. "Do you have a home?" he asked, suddenly changing the topic. "Yeah." "Far?" "It's in Laurelhurst." "And where's your family from?" "Charbonneau?" "As in France?" He continued without giving me a chance to correct him. "She'd love to go to France. She's very Neapolitan." I squinted in confusion. "Do you mean cosmopolitan?" "No," he replied, dead serious. I saw his hand raise and do a chopping motion 3 times. Growing up as a kid, I always associated the word Neapolitan with France, thinking it was named after Napoleon. I mean, hell, even as an adult, I still associate it that way every time I have the ice cream with those 3 flavors. But I know that it isn't. But with that chopping motion, I figured Robert was set in his mind that Neapolitan was related to France. Napoleon and the guillotine was on his mind. But was it a threat against me? Hey, so is it 6:01 yet?" I began to ask, reaching for my phone. "We have 5 minutes." He was quick to interrupt, his raised voice startling me and making me keep my phone in my pocket. "Let me tell you a story first." "A story about what?" He stared me down silently. His eyes were dark caverns, but I was still uncomfortable just knowing that he was looking at me. "Timpani's last date," he finally said. "She went out with a nice kid we'll call John. I posted an ad on Craigslist and he responded, not afraid of my rules. He showed up right on time. I was impressed because I could see him on my security camera, standing outside my door just waiting for the minutes to tick by. I was so happy when he knocked exactly at 6:01. I asked him if he followed all my rules. I could see that his tie was green, and he had on a white shirt. He told me his socks were orange. I could smell the vinegar on his breath, so I took his word for it. I introduced him to Timpani, and then I saw them off to have a wonderful night." He took a long breath and resumed his story. "I woke up that morning, wondering how the dates had gone. Timpani was in the den, sleeping like an angel. But when I watched my morning news, the first story was about a driver being pulled out of the river. Actually, his torso was being pulled out, but his legs were found in a rail yard, and his head was on a turnpike." Robert clicked his tongue. "Nasty car wreck." "What are you getting at?" I asked warily. Robert chuckled, a creepy laugh that made me shiver. He sent me a voicemail, screaming about Bodron this and teeth that and heads those. I guess my point is, he lied to me. He didn't follow a rule even though he said he understood them all. If he had have listened, he and Timpani could be married by now. "Listen, sir, maybe I should go." "Go?" "Yeah, I'm just not seeing the point to all this, so maybe I'm the wrong person after all." "Point? The point is simple." He leaned forward, his face finally coming into the light, his cheeks taking on a sunken appearance in the darkness of the shadows. "When I ask where your orange and green is, you better not be lying to me." I exhaled a little. Listen, I can show you my undershirt if you want. It's got all 3 colors on it. Robert chuckled again. Nope. I'll take your word for it, too. Won't hurt me at all. He looked at his watch. Well, looks like it's time for your date. Come on. He grunted as he stood. Get up and turn around. I'll walk you to her. Right, I said, getting up. Listen, I did have a couple of questions first. Like, how old is Timpani? And, I mean, some of those rules are important. Robert interrupted. He spun me backwards and started pushing me, one hand on my shoulder to guide me. I know, don't worry. They'll make sense when you meet my girl. And don't worry about her age, you two are perfect. Way better than John from Craigslist. Actually, that was my last question. Who posts a personal ad on a telephone pole? Robert sucked in air. After what happened to John, Craigslist banned me. I wasn't sure what to think as I walked blindly towards my waiting date. I watched the hallways darken and grow plain in their decoration. The only piece of art was a very somber piece, a Gothic oil painting depicting a man on a bed being devoured by a hideous creature atop his chest. What stood out was the monster's shadow, which appeared to have its own face staring at the scene in horror, almost as if the shadow was a separate person. We stopped outside a rinky-dink door that looked like it should have belonged to a shitty hall closet more than someone's bedroom. Robert shushed me before I could even talk, then pulled out his phone. I noticed him looking at his watch intently as he flicked his phone open to a security app. His finger hovered over a button. All the while, he stared at his watch ticking away. He hurriedly tapped the phone, and I heard the doorbell chime, a rhythmic drum beat playing throughout the house. I realized he had still been waiting for the clock to hit 6:01 exactly. We stood there for a few more seconds. Want to make it believable, Robert whispered to me before finally unlocking and opening the door and pulling me inside, still backwards the whole time. Timpani, look who's here, the father cried in excitement. My mind reeling, it took me a moment to finally introduce myself. Like an idiot, I said she looked beautiful before I had even been turned around. Her dad finally spun me and I got a chance to look at her. To my amazement, she was pretty. I mean, I'd been expecting a circus freak, but she was perfectly normal, with long brown hair, freckled skin, and doe eyes. I looked right into them, remembering rule number 4. Hi, she said, her voice feeble and shy. At this point, just from her simple greeting, I began to wonder if I'd walked into something else entirely. Not a ridiculous date or a murderer's home, but the house of an abusive, overbearing father and his distressed daughter. I thought I suddenly found myself thrust into a rescue operation that I wasn't ready for. We didn't talk much. In fact, she never said anything more to me. Just nodded her head or in agreement to everything I said, which wasn't much because I was eager to get out of there. Robert escorted me and his daughter out, wishing us a good night. The car ride was awkward, to say the least. I asked Timpani questions, but she just sat there making little noises of acknowledgement, but never really saying a word. She just kept staring ahead at the road, so I kept my eyes focused there too, and went silent. It wasn't until we pulled into the parking lot of a nearby restaurant that I finally asked the question. Are you safe at home? I questioned delicately. You can tell me. I mean, does your dad hurt you? Keep you locked up? She looked over at him. Why would you say that? I shook my head and just told her to forget it. I would try again later, but for now, I'd get her somewhere that maybe she could open up and talk. It was a cheap chain restaurant. A random pick, honestly. I hadn't planned on the date going this far, so I just picked something easy. The first thing I came across. She seemed kind of hesitant about going inside. Are you sure? She asked. I reassured her that it was alright and urged her to come inside with me. She finally got out of the car and, though hesitant, walked in with me. I noticed her dress was a little baggy looking, but it didn't surprise me given how sheltered her existence seemed to be. It fell against her body in odd waves, the excess cloth creating strange shapes. We were seated, and it wasn't long before we were ordering. She was nervous, constantly looking around, but despite her life locked up in her home, she didn't have a problem ordering when our waiter came by. In fact, she ordered 2 entrees and an appetizer, and I joked that she must have been hungry, but she didn't react. Do you think these light bulbs are 60 watt? She asked me after we placed our orders, looking up at the ceiling. I laughed. Why does it matter? Timpani looked at me, worried. She doesn't like it too bright. She? Yeah. She looked down at the table. Bodron. I laughed again. Right, Bodron. I'm supposed to talk to her or something, right? I shook my head. Listen, I'm gonna use the bathroom. I'll be right back. Wait, but Bodron, you didn't say hello. She trailed off. I was already getting up and walking to the bathroom. I gave her a second to see if she was going to say anything else, but she just looked at the table. I didn't need to use the toilet, but I was looking for an excuse to get on my phone and call the police. They needed to know that this girl was in serious danger, held hostage by her own father. I was in the bathroom for a minute, trying to decide if this was an emergency situation, if they should come to the restaurant or see how this girl lived at home. A scream interrupted my thoughts. I hustled out of the bathroom and looked around. My table was empty, except for a waitress kneeling next to it with 2 other staff members gathered around her. The waitress was bleeding. She bit me. The woman cried as I got close. All 3 looked in my direction. Where'd she go? I asked, confused. They pointed to the front door. I ran outside looking for her. My car was parked in the same spot I left it, in the back of the parking lot just on the edge of a street light. The driver door was wide open, but the interior light was off. I hustled over, thinking maybe the sheltered girl had freaked out when the waitress approached her suddenly. I didn't even wonder how she'd gotten into my locked car. Timpani was there, sitting on the passenger seat, hugging her knees to her chest like a child, her back turned to me so I could just make out the side of her face. Hey, what's going on? I said. I leaned in, rested an arm on top of the car. You alright? Fine, she said, her voice a faint whisper, weak and wavering. Did you bite the waitress? I asked, chuckling a little. I didn't. She put an odd stress in her tone when she said, tea. What came out of her next shocked me, because she said more in a couple minutes than she had all night. Timpani's voice was still a whisper, but it was firm, almost like someone else was speaking. Do you know the Trior? There was a man named Robert Kelly. He was the most handsome man in his little village and had a lovely wife. But he was always searching for more, not satisfied with one woman. He had many other mistresses in neighboring villages, none of whom knew about the others, and he was able to keep his secrets so well because of his set of rules that he always followed to make sure his deceptions were not uncovered. But his womanizing led him to cross paths with Coronat, mother of demons, disguised as a normal human. He wooed her like any other woman who came into his life, and she fell for it for many months, until in a moment of laziness, Robert Kelly broke one of his own rules and forgot to bathe after visiting one of his mistresses. Coroner smelled the other woman on him and knew immediately what he had done. She would not tolerate his affairs. When she discovered the other woman in his life, she kidnapped all of them and forced Robert to watch as she devoured each and every one. Soon she gave birth to a beautiful daughter, placing her under Robert's care and telling him, "This is the only woman in your life now. She is as much the spirit of your lovers as she is me. Many souls living in one. You will care for her forever and on. You will never be rid of her, try as you might. Displease her, and you'll see her true side." And then she left Robert to take care of his new daughters. And that is the story of the birth of the Trior. Her voice was cracking as she neared the end of the story. I crawled halfway into the car, gingerly reaching out a hand towards her half-turned shoulder. "Timpani?" I remembered saying, but I didn't remember there being a quiver in my voice until I listened to the tape recording from that night. Even then, it was still switched on in my pocket, recording the whole thing when she attacked me. My fingers barely brushed her shoulder, and as Timpani started to turn her head, the back of her long dress lifted up, and I was face to face with a mass of teeth and claws lunging at me. That was when I screamed and fell back. My shoulders hit the concrete, but I ignored the pain, focused on my legs, which were still draped over the seat and being raked by razor blades for fingernails. I kicked out and felt teeth dig into my foot, piercing straight through the shoe. They were so long and sharp that I felt them grind together and exit out the opposing sides of my foot. I screamed, kicked out with my other foot, hitting her right in the face. She fell back, yanking my foot along with her as she crashed against the passenger door. She released me, and adrenaline let me shoot up without feeling any pain. While she thrashed, I braced myself against the roof of my car and swung my legs inside, kicking into her with momentous force. The passenger door was knocked open, and out she fell through. I quickly settled into the driver's seat, fumbled with my keys as I tried to get them in the ignition. My hands were shaking, the keys rattling. Blood was running down my leg like a waterfall. I drove the keys home finally, then heard a clank, a hard tap of fingernails against metal. I looked to my right. Fingers, too long to be real, gripped the bottom of the door frame. Another hand came up, grasping the side of the door, claws raking strips in the paint. Then two more hands burst forward, each latching onto another part of the frame, clicking and clacking as the fingernails tapped a steady rhythm. Timpani's head slowly raised into view, those horrible white eyes, teeth like an anglerfish. But then I realized that I wasn't looking at Timpani, at least not as I knew her. This must have been Bodron. I didn't hesitate any longer, started my car and peeled out. Bodron was dragged along the ground for a moment before the pavement took her. My car bounced as I shot over a curb and took off. I didn't see any signs of Bodron or Timpani, whatever she was called, in my mirror. Liquid sloshed around my feet, and I realized just how bad my leg was bleeding when I looked down and saw a pool of my blood swaying back and forth as my car turned onto the freeway. I pulled out my phone and redialed my last call. It was to Timpani's father. I remember the exact call. My tape recorder only picked up part of what I said, and it got damaged afterwards, which I didn't think would help any. But I'm doing my best to write it down exactly as I hear it and remember it, omitting the parts that I can't make out. Robert's voicemail picked up, and I started yelling at it, angry and injured. "Why didn't you tell me about Bodron? God, those teeth and those claws. What is it?" At that point, there was a large metallic thump on the recording. I remember looking at the roof of my car and seeing it crunch and squish as something crawled along the top. She's here. She's here. Two pairs of arms slammed down against my windshield, claws digging little holes in the glass which spit shards out into my face. My mouth dropped in shock as Bodron's hideous face stretched down to look at me. I remember her eyes being wide and bloodshot, her face a macabre grin full of sharp fangs. It almost seemed like she was smiling at me. I started swerving back and forth on the lonely freeway, tires squealing against the asphalt. What do I do? How do I stop her? Bodron raised back one of her forearms and drove the claws like a drill right through the glass. The sharp nails jabbed at my eyes and were stopped only by the windshield, the arm a mess of blood from scraping through the narrow hole. I instinctively jerked my steering wheel to the side and looked in horror as the front of my car aimed at the freeway's retaining wall. My car blasted through the concrete and sailed over the edge of the raised freeway, down into a pit a few hundred feet down. It's true what they say about your life flashing before your eyes when you're in a near-death situation like that. In the span of a few seconds, while my car soared down towards some train tracks, I saw myself going through my life again. When my car crashed, I blacked out. I woke up staring at the floor of my car. My face was wet and blood dripped steadily down onto my forehead. I realized I was upside down and undid my seatbelt, falling with a hefty thud. Amazingly, aside from the grievous injury to my leg, the crash didn't seem to have me any worse for the wear. The driver's door was buckled and had fallen open. I crawled along my back until I was out of the car, staring up at the sky. Rule number 1. A voice whispered dreadfully. I couldn't place where it was coming from, but it tingled my spine. Number 2. It continued, haunting and raspy. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. The voice was picking up speed now. It sounded angry. 6, 7, and... It sounded like it was coming from above me. 8. Bodron's horrifying face snapped over the edge of my toppled car, her monstrous arms gripping the edge and pulling her body closer towards mine. You didn't follow the rules, she said, her lipless mouth clicking open and shut. A long leg draped over the edge of the car. I recognized Timpani's dress covering Bodron, but her body looked twisted and backwards. The foot dropped down and stepped next to my right ear, brushing my cheek, gnarly toes pinning my hair down. Her clawed hands reached down for my chest. My head was dizzy, the blood loss and the crash both getting to me, but I had to think of some way to save myself. I remembered rule number 7 then, what I had to do. I reached into my mouth and grabbed one of my front teeth, yanking as hard as I could. It broke off, taking some root with it. I set it down next to the foot, just hoping a partial tooth was enough to appease her. She stopped her strike, cocked her head. Her neck worked like a snake as she stared at the little bit of tooth next to her left foot. Her teeth clicked together, and her entire body seemed to twitch and writhe as she pulled back and slithered atop the car, disappearing from view. I breathed heavily. Tried to let myself sigh, but couldn't feel enough relief to do so. Struggling up, I got into a sitting position. I was about to call 911 when my phone began to ring. Sluggishly, I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. Answered it with a gasp. "You're alive," Robert said on the other end. I didn't have any words to reply, so he just kept going. "You must have figured it out. And how's Tabla doing?" It took me a moment to register the name, and then I questioned, "Tabla?" My car rocked, and I heard scraping above me. A moment later, a head screeched into view mere inches away from my face. As horrifying as Bodron before it, and yet completely different. It opened its mouth and leaned in towards my lips. Its wiry jaw worked open. Number 5. It slithered the words out, long tongue flicking from its mouth. I woke up in an ambulance. Paramedics talking nervously over me. My body was numb, probably from some impressive painkillers, but I could still tell that I was hurt. Badly. I could see my leg bandaged, could feel that my lips had been roughly shredded by something sharp. I wasn't sure how I had survived, why I hadn't been torn into pieces like Timpani's last date. When I looked down again, I realized that my nice shirt had been ripped off, revealing my joke leprechaun shirt with all the required colors. Orange, white, and green. It occurred to me that India's flag had the same colors as Ireland's. But maybe that was all as coincidental as the 3 flavors of Neapolitan ice cream.